In the world of American politics, certain figures rise not just to prominence, but to controversy. Drawing both admiration and criticism, Charlie Kirk was one such figure. A man whose journey, marked by ambition, fame, and bitter enemies, would end not in quiet retirement, but in sudden, violent tragedy. Born on October 14, 1993, in Arlington Heights, Illinois, Charlie grew up in a middle-class suburban neighborhood where life was predictable, safe, and shaped by traditional values. His father was an architect who believed in discipline and design. His mother, a homemaker who devoted herself to family and faith. Their home was not extravagant, but it was filled with a sense of stability and purpose. Young Charlie was taught from an early age that belief, effort, and conviction could carry a person further than wealth or privilege. As a boy, he was restless, ambitious, and always searching for a cause that would allow him to leave a mark. Initially, that cause seemed to be the military. Like many young men, he dreamed of donning the uniform, serving at West Point, and carving a career of discipline and sacrifice. But when that dream was shattered by rejection, Charlie's path bent sharply in another direction. And rather than accept defeat, he turned the sting of failure into the fuel for a new mission: to become a defender of conservative values and, more importantly, a voice for young Americans who felt unseen by the political establishment. At only 18 years old, he co-founded Turning Point USA in 2012. It's an organization that began in small rooms with folding chairs and flyers, but which carried with it a vision as vast as the country itself. Kirk's determination was relentless. He drove across states in borrowed or rented cars, spoke at schools where barely a handful of students gathered to hear him, and slowly, step by painstaking step, transformed a grassroots idea into one of the most powerful youth movements in American political history. By the mid-2010s, Turning Point USA had spread across campuses nationwide, planting chapters that promoted free market values, limited government, and what Kirk frequently described as American exceptionalism. Donors who believed in his cause began to fund the organization, impressed not just by his words, but by his sheer persistence. Social media amplified his voice, and soon his debates, speeches, and confrontations with professors and protesters were circulating online, drawing millions of views. Admirers saw him as fearless, a young warrior standing against the perceived dominance of liberal culture on campuses, while critics accused him of fueling division, spreading misinformation, and thriving on outrage. But love him or loathe him, Charlie Kirk had made himself impossible to ignore. His charisma and sharp debating style made him a favorite guest on conservative media outlets, and his close ties with political leaders, including the Trump family, elevated his profile. He was no longer just a college activist. He was a national figure, the face of a movement that sought to redefine youth politics. Yet, with fame came shadows. Wherever he spoke, controversy followed. Some universities canceled his events due to security concerns, while others braced for clashes between supporters and protesters. Outside his rallies, chants and confrontations became a regular scene, and inside the crowds swelled with energy both supportive and hostile. Kirk thrived in the spotlight, often saying that criticism was proof that his message mattered. But behind that bold exterior lay a man under enormous pressure. Friends and colleagues recalled long nights, endless travel, and a constant barrage of threats that weighed on him more than he let on. The same spotlight that elevated him also burned him, and while he smiled and spoke confidently on stage, in quieter moments he carried the fatigue and the knowledge that his work had made him a target. Fame at such a young age is a double-edged sword. It brings power, but strips away privacy. It delivers influence, but invites enemies. By the year 2025, Charlie Kirk was not just an activist or an organizer, he was a brand, a symbol, and to some, a lightning rod of everything they opposed. His American comeback tour became his most ambitious project yet, drawing thousands at each stop. The events were part rally, part lecture, and part performance where young conservatives cheered and waved flags, while critics lined the streets outside. Every stop seemed bigger than the last, every speech sharper, every reaction louder. Supporters found hope in his words. Detractors found reasons to protest, and the cycle of attention grew only more intense. Yet Kirk pressed on with determination, declaring that his mission was to wake up America's youth and set them on a new path. But as the crowds grew, so did the risks. Security became a pressing issue with heightened measures at every venue. Threats arrived in messages, chants escalated into confrontations, and the sense of danger became a constant companion on the tour. Still, Kirk refused to back down. To him, retreat was never an option. Every obstacle was simply another test of will. Those who knew him well say that he was driven not just by politics, but by a personal fire. An almost relentless need to prove himself worthy after early rejections and to live up to the expectations of his followers and donors. And yet, there were moments when the cracks showed, when exhaustion dimmed his energy, when doubt lingered in his private words, when he wondered what toll this battle was taking on him as a person. Then came September 2025, and the tour reached Utah Valley University. Nearly 3,000 people filled the auditorium, a sea of faces lit with anticipation, voices rising in chants and cheers. Outside, protesters shouted slogans, their voices carrying into the night. Inside, Kirk stood at the podium, confident as ever, delivering another speech that blended fire with faith, conviction with charisma. To those in the audience, it felt like just another night on the tour, another moment of inspiration. But history would not remember it as ordinary. In that hall, in that charged atmosphere, the arc of Charlie Kirk's life reached its breaking point. What happened next would leave the nation stunned and grieving, sparking questions that still haunt the public conscience. Within minutes, the voice that had traveled across campuses and airwaves, that had sparked movements and ignited debates, would fall silent forever. And so as we look back at his rise, we see the path that led here. A boy with dreams of the military who became a political warrior. A rejected applicant who turned into a national leader, a figure who carried with him both devotion and disdain. Charlie Kirk's rise was meteoric, but his fall was sudden, shocking, and irreversible. If you're captivated by the story so far, make sure to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think shaped Charlie Kirk the most? His ambition, his controversies, or his struggles? Your perspective matters, and we want to hear it. Because this is more than the story of a political figure. It is the story of a man caught in the storm of modern America, a man who achieved so much and yet could not escape the dangers that came with his fame. In part 2 of this chilling story, we will step fully into the night of the Utah Valley University shooting, uncovering how a rally became a crime scene, how celebration turned to chaos, and how one man, as life was cut short before his mission was complete. The night of the 10th of September 2025 at Utah Valley University would forever be etched in memory as the moment when Charlie Kirk's voice, one that had sparked debates, stirred controversy, and inspired countless young conservatives, was silenced forever. Inside the packed auditorium, anticipation filled the air as thousands of students, activists, and supporters gathered under bright stage lights, their faces glowing with admiration and curiosity. Kirk, dressed in his usual tailored suit, exuded confidence as he launched into another fiery speech about freedom, responsibility, and the urgency of political awakening among America's youth. For the first half hour, it seemed like any other rally. Charged with energy, chants echoing against the walls and cell phone cameras, capturing every gesture. Yet beneath the surface of cheers and applause, there was an undercurrent of unease. Security had been on edge all evening, scanning the restless crowd outside where protesters held signs, shouted slogans, and clashed verbally with supporters entering the venue. Still, inside the hall, the show went on as Kirk delivered what would unknowingly become his final speech. Witnesses later recalled how he spoke with unusual passion that night, pausing at times as if reflecting deeply, his words tinged with urgency, his tone sharpened by the weight of the moment. Some felt he knew the risks he was taking, that he sensed the storm approaching, though no one could have predicted how swiftly the night would collapse into chaos. As the clock neared the final half of his address, a loud crack cut through the room, a sound that froze the audience in disbelief. For a split second, no one moved, many thinking it was perhaps a firework or technical malfunction. But when the second and third shots rang out, panic erupted. Screams pierced the air as the crowd surged toward the exits. Chairs toppled and cell phones slipped from trembling hands. Security personnel rushed the stage shielding Kirk, but the damage had already been done. Eyewitnesses described the scene as surreal, the sight of a man who had seemed untouchable brought down in a moment of shocking violence. The shooter, later identified as a young man with a history of political grievances, was subdued quickly, but the auditorium had already descended into a nightmare. Blood on the floor, cries for help. The chaos of thousands trying to flee was a scene that no one present would ever erase from their minds. Kirk was rushed from the stage, paramedics fighting desperately to stabilize him, but the injuries were too severe. By the time he was transported to the nearest hospital, his pulse was faint, his body weakened, and despite the best efforts of doctors, Charlie Kirk was pronounced dead that night. He was only 31 years old. News of the shooting spread with the speed of wildfire. Within minutes, social media was ablaze with breaking alerts, blurry videos from inside the auditorium, and frantic posts from attendees who had lived through the terror. Headlines flashed across every network. Charlie Kirk shot dead at Utah Valley University. To some, it was a devastating tragedy, the loss of a rising political figure who had devoted his youth to reshaping America's conversation. To others, it was a shocking reminder of the dangers of division, a brutal symbol of how political battles had spilled over into bloodshed. Regardless of where one stood on his views, the fact remained: an American life cut short in its prime, in front of thousands, live-streamed into history. In the hours following his death, the auditorium was sealed off as investigators combed through evidence, interviewing terrified witnesses, piecing together the timeline of events. The shooter's motives, his planning, his grievances, became subjects of national speculation. Some pointed to online posts that revealed anger at Kirk's political stances, others to personal struggles that had spiraled into violence. But in the midst of speculation, one undeniable truth remained. A life had been stolen, and a movement was left without its leader. The following days felt surreal. Vigils were held across campuses, candles lit in silence for a man who had spent his career speaking loudly. Supporters gathered in prayer circles, some weeping, others defiantly raising flags, vowing to continue his mission. Opponents, while critical of his politics, expressed shock at the violence, many insisting that disagreement should never end in death. Prominent leaders from across the political spectrum issued statements, some offering condolences, others reflecting on the state of the nation. Former President Donald Trump, a close ally of Kirk, called his death a devastating blow to the conservative movement and to America's youth who looked to him for guidance. President Joe Biden, while often opposed to Kirk's views, condemned the attack as a senseless act of violence that has no place in our democracy. The bipartisan mourning underscored the gravity of the moment, whatever one thought of Charlie Kirk. His assassination was not just the silencing of a voice, but a wound in the fabric of America's already fragile unity. In the weeks that followed, media outlets revisited Kirk's life in documentaries, panel discussions, and endless debates. Footage of his early days founding Turning Point USA replayed alongside clips of his most heated confrontations on campuses. Interviews with his friends and colleagues painted a picture of a tireless worker, a man who sacrificed personal comfort for his mission, who thrived in conflict but also carried the heavy loneliness that comes with public life. His critics dissected his rhetoric, questioning whether his confrontational style had inflamed the very hostility that consumed him. But amidst the noise, one theme emerged again and again. His story was not simple, and his death left questions that may never be fully answered. Was it the product of political hatred or mental instability, a culture increasingly addicted to outrage. The search for answers became as much about America itself as it was about Charlie Kirk. For those closest to him, however, the loss was deeply personal. Friends described the silence of his absence. The empty office at Turning Point USA headquarters, where his energy had once filled the halls. Family members mourned not the public figure, but the son and brother who had once dreamed of West Point, who had been a boy with boundless ambition. In moments of grief, they remembered his humor, his determination, quiet conversations far from the spotlight where he let down the armor he wore before the world. For them, the tragedy was not measured in headlines or political impact, but in the ache of a loved one gone too soon. As the investigation into the shooting unfolded, authorities revealed chilling details of the shooter's planning. He had attended other rallies, studied security patterns, and waited for the moment when Kirk would be most vulnerable on stage in front of thousands. The calculated nature of the act only deepened the horror, showing that this was no random burst of chaos, but a deliberate attempt to silence a man whose voice had grown too loud for his enemies to ignore. The trial that followed kept the story alive in the media for months, every new revelation reopening wounds for the victims who had been in that auditorium and for a nation struggling to understand how such violence had become reality. Halfway through this story, let us pause because this is not just about one man, one shooting, or one moment of chaos. It is about the world we live in today, where words can spark movements but also inspire hatred, where fame can be a shield but also a target. If you've stayed with us this far, we want to hear from you. Do you believe Charlie Kirk's story reflects a deeper sickness in society? Or was this tragedy the act of one individual, isolated but catastrophic? Comment your thoughts below because your voice, your perspective, is part of this ongoing conversation. And if you find these deep explorations meaningful, hit the like button. It helps keep stories like this alive and ensures that more people can join us in understanding the human cost of fame and conflict. As months turned to a year, Charlie Kirk's legacy continued to ripple outward. Turning Point USA, though shaken, pledged to continue his mission, naming new leaders but always invoking his vision. At memorial events, his speeches were played to crowds who listened in silence, the voice of a man, gone but not forgotten. Statues were proposed, scholarships launched in his name, debates held over how his life should be remembered. To some, he was a hero who gave young conservatives a voice. To others, he was a divisive figure whose methods intensified the culture wars. Yet the undeniable fact was that his life and death had become a mirror, reflecting the best and worst of America's current era. His story was no longer just his own. It had become part of the nation's collective history. As we close this chapter of his life, we return to that fateful night. Imagine the lights of the auditorium dimmed, the voices of thousands raised, the energy of a man at the peak of his influence, and then imagine how quickly it all turned. In seconds, celebration became chaos, confidence became fear, and a life filled with ambition was extinguished. That contrasts the thin line between triumph and tragedies. What makes this story unforgettable, haunting, and deeply human? Charlie Kirk's name will be remembered not only for the movement he built, but for the shocking way his journey ended. His life reminds us of the fragile line between conviction and vulnerability, between fame and danger, between speaking loudly and being silenced forever. And so, to you, our viewers of Celebrity Terror Tales, we leave this story with a challenge. Remember Charlie Kirk not only as a political figure, but as a human being whose choices, triumphs, and fate illuminate truths about all of us. Share your thoughts in the comments. What do you believe his story teaches us? Should his legacy be one of inspiration, caution, or both? And if you value stories that dig beneath the headlines, that uncover the emotion and humanity behind tragedy, then subscribe to our channel and join us for more journeys into the lives of celebrities whose stories ended in mystery and darkness. Because this is what we do together. We keep these tales alive, not out of sensationalism, but out of the belief that every story has something to teach and every life, no matter how controversial, deserves to be remembered. Stay with us for our next chilling tale, and until then, reflect on the fragile thread of destiny that connects us all.